Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Today we're looking at one of the most infamous events in gangster history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Yeah, not exactly a box of chocolates and roses, is it? But it's a story that pulls you in. 1920 Chicago Prohibition is in full swing, and the battle for control of the city's bootlicking operations is raging.
You've got these two larger-than-life figures, Al Capone, head of the South Side outfit, and his nemesis, George Bugs Moran, running the North Side gang. They weren't exactly sharing a cup of coffee and talking things out.
Not even close. They were locked in a deadly struggle for power, fueled by ambition, revenge, and a whole lot of illegal booze. There were attempts on each other's lives. Capone had already earned a reputation for ruthlessness, even though he was just 30 years old.
And Moran was no angel himself. He'd been involved in crime since his teens, racking up arrests before he could even legally drink. He took over the North Side gang after the previous leader, Jaime Weiss, was gunned down. Many believed Capone was behind that.
Moran truly despised Capone. He particularly hated Capone's involvement in prostitution. He also felt a deep loyalty to Weiss, so the rivalry was as much personal as it was about territory and money.
So let's get to the heart of it. February 14th, 1929. Moran's men are gathered at their headquarters, a garage behind the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street. They think they're about to receive a shipment of illegal whiskey.
Inside, you have this mix of characters. John May, a former safecracker turned mechanic working on a truck. Then you have the Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, known for their brutality.
And then there's Reinhard Schwimmer. Here's a guy who's an optometrist, but gave it all up for the excitement of gambling and hanging out with gangsters. It really makes you wonder about the strange appeal of that life, even for someone coming from a completely different world.
Schwimmer's presence really underscores how blurry the lines were between the straight world and the underworld back then. It shows how easy it was to get pulled into this dangerous lifestyle.
While they're waiting, a black Cadillac pulls up. Looks just like an unmarked police car, complete with siren and rifle rack. 4 men get out, 2 in police uniforms.
What happens next is pure calculated violence. The gunmen, believed to have been Fred Killer Burke and John Scalise, herd the 7 men against the wall and opened fire with Thompson submachine guns and shotguns.
Witnesses later said they heard this incredibly loud, rapid gunfire, like a car backfiring. But these guys weren't messing around. They fired round after round, even after their victims were down. 2
of the victims, John May and James Clark, were shot in the face with shotguns at close range. It was brutal, even by the standards of the time.
Here's a fascinating detail. After the shooting, they marched 2 of their own guys out of the garage at gunpoint, pretending to make an arrest. The neighbors see this and assume it was a legitimate police raid.
It was a clever trick, capitalizing on the fact that a lot of people already distrusted the police, especially in a city like Chicago where corruption was rampant. It bought them valuable time to get away.
Inside the garage, 6 men are dead. Frank Gusenberg, though, is still alive. He'd been hit 14 times, but was somehow clinging to life. They rushed him to the hospital, hoping he'd name the killers.
He stayed true to the code of silence, though. When they asked who shot him, he famously said, "No one shot me." He died 3 hours later.
So where was Bugs Moran in all of this? Well, as luck would have it, he was running late. When he saw the police car outside the garage, he knew something was wrong and took off. That decision saved his life.
There's a theory that the gunman mistook one of Moran's associates, Albert Weinshank, for Moran. They were similar in build and were even wearing similar coats. That might explain why they went ahead with the killings, even though their main target wasn't there.
The massacre shook Chicago, even made national news. The brutality, the planning involved, and the mystery surrounding the killers captured everyone's imagination.
Photographs of the blood-soaked garage and the victims' bodies were published in newspapers. It was a stark visual representation of just how violent and lawless that era was.
Of course, all eyes immediately turned to Al Capone, especially given his history with Moran. But here's the thing. Capone had what seemed like an airtight alibi. He was being questioned by police in Miami at the time of the massacre.
And Capone's right-hand man, Jack Machine Gun McGurn, who many believed orchestrated the whole thing, also had an alibi. He claimed he was with his girlfriend at a hotel.
So the police were faced with this puzzle. How do you connect the massacre to Capone when the prime suspects have seemingly solid alibis?
Well, that's where things take an unexpected turn. Months later, a seemingly unrelated event involving a gangster named Fred Killer Burke in a small town in Michigan would change everything.
So it seems we're about to head to Michigan.
Let's talk about Fred Burke, a prime suspect in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. He was laying low in St. Joseph, Michigan, using the name Frederick Dane.
You'd think a gangster would pick a bigger city to hide out. What happened?
Burke's attempt at a quiet life. Well, it didn't last long. In December 1929, just 10 months after the massacre, he had a run-in with the law.
I bet it wasn't a parking ticket.
No, it started with a drunk driving accident. Burke rear-ended someone, and when a local patrolman, Charles Skelly, tried to stop him, Burke panicked and sped away.
So this probably didn't end well for Officer Skelly.
Unfortunately, it didn't. Officer Skelly pursued Burke and eventually caught up to him. He jumped onto the running board of Burke's car, but Burke pulled out a gun and shot him 3 times. Skelly died that night, the only St. Joseph police officer ever killed in the line of duty.
It shows that even in a small town, violence could erupt, especially when it came to the world of these gangsters.
Absolutely. But it also turned out to be a major break in the massacre investigation. Burke abandoned his car and fled, but the registration led police to his bungalow, where they found a lot more than they bargained for.
Like what? What did they find at his hideout?
Remember, Burke was already wanted for robbery and murder in Ohio, so what the police found wasn't totally unexpected, but it was certainly incriminating. A huge stash of weapons, including rifles, pistols, shotguns, and most importantly, 2 Thompson submachine guns.
Those Thompson submachine guns must have been a huge red flag.
They were. The police suspected they might be connected to the massacre and sent them to Chicago for analysis. This was one of the earliest uses of forensic ballistics in a major crime investigation.
So did those guns match the ones used in the massacre?
The tests were conclusive. Both guns found in Burke's possession were used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. One of them had even been used in another high-profile mob hit, the killing of New York gangster Frankie Yale a year and a half earlier.
So finally there was some real evidence, a direct link to the massacre. What happened to Burke?
Burke vanished after shooting Officer Skelly. It took over a year to find him, hiding out on a farm in Missouri, using the alias Richard Franklin White.
Seems like these guys were constantly changing their names. Did it work?
Not for long. He was caught. Both Chicago and Michigan wanted him. Chicago for the massacre, and Michigan for the murder of Officer Skelly.
So who got him?
The governor of Missouri decided to send Burke to Michigan. The evidence against him there was the strongest. Burke was tried and convicted for Skelly's murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Even though Burke was convicted, it must have been frustrating for the authorities in Chicago. They never got to officially connect them to the massacre.
You're right. The massacre remained officially unsolved. But then in 1935, a small-time criminal named Byron Bolton made some claims that shed new light on the case.
Okay, another twist. Who was Byron Bolton? And how does he fit into all of this?
Bolton was an ex-Navy machine gunner who got caught up in a life of crime. He was associated with the Egan's Rats, a St. Louis gang that had ties to both Capone and the Purple Gang.
So what made Bolton decide to start talking?
He was arrested in 1935, along with other members of the Barker Gang, during an FBI raid. He witnessed a shootout where one of his associates was killed and chose to cooperate with the authorities.
Facing serious time can make anyone rethink things. So what did he tell them about the massacre?
Bolton claimed he was part of the massacre. He said he was a lookout, watching the garage and waiting for Bugs Moran to arrive. He was supposed to signal the hit team.
And remember, Moran was late, right?
Right. Bolton said he mistook one of Moran's men, Albert Weinshank, for Moran. That would explain why they went in when they did, even though their main target wasn't there.
So Bolton backs up that theory about the mistaken identity.
He does. And he gave the FBI a list of names. Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, Fred Goetz, Bob Carey Raymond, Crane Neck Nugent, and Claude Maddox, claiming they were the killers.
It's a pretty detailed confession. What did the FBI do with that information? Did they pursue it?
Well, at that time, the FBI didn't have jurisdiction over state murder cases like the massacre, but they were definitely interested in what he knew about the Barker gang. Bolton gave them information that led to the deaths of Ma Barker and her son Freddie in a shootout with the FBI.
So Bolton was more useful to them in taking down the Barker gang. But did his claims about the massacre go anywhere?
In a way, they did. The FBI kept his confession confidential for a time, but the Chicago American newspaper got a hold of the story and published a version of it, claiming the massacre had been solved.
That must have created a sensation. But if the FBI didn't act on it, did Bolton's confession really change anything?
That's the question. Despite the publicity and some evidence that backed up parts of his story, there were never any charges filed against the people he named. Many of them were already dead by 1935. The ones who were still alive, like Claude Maddox, said they were innocent.
So officially, the St. Valentine's Day massacre is still unsolved. But between Bolton's confession and those guns found in Burke's possession, It's hard to ignore the connection to Capone.
It's true, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. But in the world of organized crime, proving something beyond a reasonable doubt is very difficult.
The massacre really shows the dark side of the 1920s. All the brutality and mystery surrounding the gangsters. Even with new forensic science and years of investigation, some secrets stay hidden.
It's a fascinating case, a real puzzle. We have missing pieces and conflicting stories. It's almost 100 years later, and we're still trying to figure it out. It's interesting, the massacre really backfired on Capone in the long run.
Really? I would think wiping out his biggest rival would make him even more powerful.
You'd think so. But the sheer brutality of it, 7 men gunned down in broad daylight, really turned public opinion against him. People were outraged.
I guess it's one thing to be a known gangster, another to be seen as the cause of a bloodbath. Even people who had tolerated Capone's activities before couldn't stomach this.
Exactly. The massacre was a public relations disaster for him. It put huge pressure on law enforcement to clean up the city and made Capone the federal government's #1 target.
Sounds like Capone's control is built on a shaky foundation. All it took was one event, even a horrible one, to bring it all crashing down.
That's a great way to put it. The massacre brought the kind of attention Capone didn't want, attention from the highest levels of government. President Hoover himself wanted Capone taken down, and they eventually got him on tax evasion.
The downfall of so many powerful people. You can't escape the tax man, even if you're a mob boss.
2 years after the massacre, Capone was indicted, convicted, and sent to prison for 11 years. He ended up in Alcatraz, a notoriously tough prison. His health went downhill from there due to complications from syphilis.
What about Moran? What happened to him?
Moran survived the massacre, but he was never the same. His gang was decimated, his reputation was tarnished, he lost his grip on the North Side and faded into obscurity. In 1946, he was arrested for a series of small-time robberies and died of lung cancer in prison in 1957.
Kind of a sad ending for a guy who was once one of the most feared gangsters in Chicago.
It really shows that power is fleeting, even in the world of organized crime. The massacre broke Moran, both in terms of his power and his spirit.
So the St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked the beginning of the end for both Capone and Moran. What about the place where it happened? That garage on Clark Street, did it just stay there as a reminder?
The garage was there for almost 40 years, like a ghost from the city's violent past. It was even used as a location for a film about the massacre in 1967. Later that same year, it was demolished.
I imagine some people were glad to see it go, wanted to move on, while others probably felt like they were erasing history.
You're right. There was debate about how to handle the legacy of organized crime, but the story of the garage doesn't end there. Some of the bricks from the wall where the victims were lined up were salvaged and sold.
That's a little creepy, isn't it? Like souvenirs of a horrible crime.
It does speak to our fascination with the dark side of things. And in a strange twist, some of those bricks are now on display at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. A physical link to one of the most notorious events in American gangster history.
It's a reminder that the past is always with us in some way.
What's fascinating is that, almost a century later, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre still holds our attention. It's got everything. Violence, larger-than-life characters. A mystery that may never be solved.
It really gives you a glimpse into a dark period of American history, the Prohibition era, when greed, corruption, and violence were rampant. Makes you wonder how many other secrets are still out there, waiting to be discovered.
It's a question that historians and anyone interested in crime will keep asking. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is a reminder that the past is always present, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered and reinterpreted.
On the subject of St. Valentine's Day, our 2 resident lovebirds, Simon and Tom, will discuss this case in their weekly review on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.